The silence of the apartment was a living thing, thick and heavy, broken only by the mournful hiss of the old radiator and the distant cry of a city siren painting the night with loneliness. Liam sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table, the wood rough and splintered beneath his forearms. His hands, once strong and sure, capable of rebuilding an engine from memory, now trembled as they smoothed out a crinkled eviction notice for the third time. The stark red letters screamed a deadline that was no longer a vague threat, but a tangible tomorrow. A cold dread, sharp as a shard of glass, settled deep in his gut. His gaze fell upon the small pile of worn bills and loose change on the table, the sum total of his world. He had counted it so many times the numbers were burned into his mind. $187. It wasn't just money, it was a measure of his failure. The final, pathetic remainder after his wife's illness had devoured their savings, their hopes, and then, finally, her. He could still smell the faint scent of antiseptic that clung to his work jacket, a ghost from the countless hospital visits. It mingled with the smell of dust and stale takeout, the scent of a life coming undone. He felt a familiar, gnawing ache in his stomach, but he wasn't sure if it was hunger or grief. He hadn't eaten today, saving the last of the bread and a can of soup for his daughter, Maya. From the other room, he could hear the soft, even sound of her breathing. She was only 8. He felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat, a suffocating combination of love and terror. How could he explain to her that this tiny, cramped apartment, the only home she remembered, was about to be ripped away? He was supposed to be her rock, her protector. Instead, he felt like a hollowed-out man, a mechanic with nothing left to fix. The grease permanently stained beneath his fingernails felt like a mockery of a life and a skill that could no longer provide. Liam pushed the chair back, the scrape of its legs against the linoleum floor sounding impossibly loud in the quiet despair. He walked to the window, peering down at the uncaring city lights that blurred through the grime. There was no one to call, no family left, and the friends who had offered sympathy at the funeral had long since faded back into their own lives, their own problems. He was an island, and the tide was coming in. The cold from the window pane seeped into his forehead as he leaned against it. He felt tears prick the back of his eyes, hot and shameful, but he choked them down. He couldn't afford to break. Not yet. He had to be strong for Maya. But as the weight of that $187 pressed down on his soul, a terrifying thought echoed in the silent chambers of his heart. Strength wasn't enough. Hope was gone. All they had left was the end of the line. The knock came 3 days before the eviction, so sharp and sudden it felt like a crack in the fragile silence of their world. Liam flinched, his heart hammering against his ribs. He expected the landlord, or worse, a sheriff's deputy. But when he cautiously opened the door, the hallway was empty. A single, crisp envelope lay on the worn welcome mat. It wasn't a bill. The paper felt heavy, expensive, bearing the embossed crest of a law firm he'd never heard of. A strange, unfamiliar sensation prickled at the back of his neck, a feeling he couldn't name. It wasn't quite hope, but the absence of immediate dread. He picked it up, his grease-stained fingers smudging the clean white surface. The sound of the heavy paper crinkling in his trembling hand was the only sound as he carried it back to the table, his breath held tight in his chest, a confusing mix of fear and a sliver of impossible curiosity slicing through the fog of his despair. He stared at his name typed neatly on the front, a formal declaration that he, a man who felt invisible, still existed somewhere on paper. He tore the envelope open with a shaky thumb, the rip sounding like a tear in the fabric of his reality. His eyes, raw from sleepless nights, struggled to focus on the dense, legal text. Words swam before him: estate, testament, demise. Then, his gaze locked onto a single line. Hereby inform you that you are the sole beneficiary to the estate of the late Mr. Arthur Beck, your great-uncle. Arthur Beck. The name meant nothing. A phantom relative from a past he never knew. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped away. He kept reading. The inheritance wasn't money. It was property, a farm deep in the countryside. The letter felt burning hot in his hand, a brand of disbelief. A lawyer's name and number were at the bottom. It had to be a mistake, a cruel, elaborate joke. And yet, the paper was real. The words were there. A farm, a home, a lifeline thrown from a ghost, appearing just as the water closed over his head. A wild, hysterical feeling began to bubble in his gut. The idea took root in the barren soil of his mind. A stubborn weed of hope. A farm. He tasted the word. It conjured images from old movies, of red barns and vast green fields stretching to the horizon, a place where Maya could run barefoot in the grass, her laughter not echoing off brick walls, but carried on a clean, fresh breeze, a place with no eviction notices, no judgmental stares from neighbors, no sirens wailing through the night. A real home. The crushing weight on his chest, the one that had been suffocating him for months, seemed to lift, just a fraction. He felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness. He looked over at the $187 on the table, and for the first time, it didn't look like an ending. It looked like just enough for gas, just enough for a new beginning. He let out a choked sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, the first real sound of emotion other than quiet grief that he'd made in a year. He found Maya in her room, carefully arranging her 2 worn dolls on her small bed. He knelt down, the floorboards groaning, and his voice was thick when he spoke. "Maya Bean," he said, the old nickname feeling foreign on his tongue. "How would you like to go live somewhere with big trees? And maybe a place for a garden?" He watched her small face, which had become so serious and quiet, transform. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, widened, and a brilliant, hopeful smile spread across her lips. The sound of her excited gasp, a pure, childish note of joy, was like a physical blow to his heart. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. In that moment, seeing the light return to her face, he felt a surge of purpose he thought he'd lost forever. He wasn't just a failure anymore, he was a father, and he was taking his daughter home. The lie felt good. It felt like breathing again after holding his breath for far too long, and he clung to it with every fiber of his being. The next 2 days were a blur of frenetic activity. The oppressive silence of the apartment was replaced by the sounds of a new purpose, the scrape of cardboard boxes on the floor, the rustle of their few clothes being packed, the clatter of plates wrapped in newspaper. The air, once thick with sorrow, now hummed with a nervous, electric energy. Liam made one last painful trip. He went to the pawn shop, the bell above the door chiming a sad welcome. He laid his heavy toolbox on the counter. The cold, familiar weight of the wrenches and sockets in his hands felt like he was selling off pieces of his own body. Each tool represented a part of his old life, his identity. But as the shop owner counted out a handful of greasy bills, Liam didn't see the tools. He saw the winding country road in his mind. He smelled the gasoline that would take them there. The sacrifice felt sharp, a deep cut, but one he was willing to make for the promise of a place to heal. Leaving the city felt like a prison break. As the familiar, grimy skyline shrank in the rearview mirror, Liam felt a knot in his shoulders begin to unwind. He gunned the engine of his old, sputtering sedan, packed so tightly with their meager belongings that he could barely see out the back window. The car, a relic from a better time, whined and protested, but it kept moving forward. Maya was a whirlwind of quiet excitement in the passenger seat, her small face pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "Look, Daddy, cows!" she would shout, her voice filled with wonder. Each mile they covered felt like a step away from the ghost of his wife, from the antiseptic smell of the hospital, from the crushing weight of failure. The steady hum of the tires on the asphalt became a mantra of escape. Forward, away, towards a new life. He allowed himself a small, real smile. He was doing it. He was saving them. The journey was long, a pilgrimage into the unknown. The sun beat down relentlessly, the heat shimmering off the endless ribbon of asphalt. They ate stale crackers and drank lukewarm water from a bottle. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change dramatically. The wide, 4-lane highways gave way to 2-lane country roads, flanked by dense, unfamiliar forests. The cell signal vanished bar by bar, until his phone was nothing more than a useless piece of glass and plastic. A prickle of unease started to crawl up Liam's spine. The initial euphoria began to fade, replaced by a low-level anxiety. The air that filtered through the open windows grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something wild, something ancient. He checked the hand-drawn map from the lawyer again. It showed them turning off the main road soon. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like spectres on the road ahead. He found the turnoff, if you could even call it that. It was a dirt track, barely visible, almost completely swallowed by overgrown bushes and thorny vines. Liam hesitated for a moment, his heart giving a nervous thud. But the map was clear. He turned the wheel, and the car lurched onto the uneven ground. Immediately, the sound of branches scraping against the metal sides of the car filled the air, a harsh, grating sound, like fingernails on a chalkboard. It was a dark green tunnel, the gnarled limbs of trees interlocking overhead. Blocking out the last of the evening light, the car bounced and jolted violently over deep ruts and half-buried rocks. Liam gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The peaceful silence of the country had vanished, replaced by an unnerving, predatory quiet. He felt Maya shift beside him, her excitement replaced by a wary stillness. The fragile hope that had sustained him for hours was now stretched thin, threatening to snap. This wasn't a road to a farm. It felt like a path to nowhere. And then, through a break in the trees, he saw it. A dark, jagged silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. He killed the engine. The car sputtered into silence. The sudden quiet was absolute. A heavy blanket that smothered all sound except for the frantic beating of his own heart. This wasn't a farmhouse. It was a skeleton. A jagged, broken thing clawing at the sky. The image he had painted in his mind, the cheerful red barn, the welcoming porch, dissolved into dust. A cold, sick feeling washed over him, dousing the last embers of his hope. This couldn't be it. It was a mistake. A ruin. He heard Maya's small, quiet intake of breath beside him, and the sound shattered what was left of his composure. The silence that followed was filled with the unspoken horror that was dawning on both of them. This was not a beginning. It was an end. He had driven them hundreds of miles from one hopeless place to the gaping maw of another. He pushed the car door open, the rusty hinge groaning in protest. He stepped out onto ground that was soft and wet, sinking slightly under his worn boots. The smell hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was a thick, suffocating miasma of rot. The sweet, cloying scent of decay, of damp wood turning back to earth, of mold, and the sharp, ammonia-like stench of animal infestation. He forced his eyes to take in the full reality of the place. The farmhouse was a crumbling wreck. A huge, gaping hole in the center of the roof exposed the rafters like a rotting ribcage. Most windows were boarded over with weathered, grey planks. The few that weren't were dark, vacant holes that seemed to suck the light from the air. This place wasn't just abandoned, it felt cursed. It was a monument to decay, a physical manifestation of the despair he had tried so desperately to escape. His stomach churned violently, a cold dread, more profound and chilling than any fear he had ever known, coiled in his gut. This wasn't a home, it was a grave. This wasn't salvation, it was a punishment. He could hear faint, furtive, scuttling sounds from within the deep shadows of the collapsing structure. The sound of things living in the ruin. A bat, a small dark flicker of movement, detached itself from the broken eaves and swooped low over his head before vanishing into the gloom of the surrounding woods. He felt a wave of nausea rise, the acrid taste of bile in the back of his throat. He had failed. The realization was a brutal, physical impact, knocking the air from his lungs. He had gambled their last dollar, their last shred of hope, on a ghost's promise, and he had lost everything. He had dragged his precious daughter out of a sinking ship and into the middle of a cold, dark, unforgiving ocean with no land in sight. "Daddy!" Maya's voice was a tiny, trembling whisper that cut through the oppressive stillness. "Is this our new house?" He couldn't turn to look at her. He couldn't bear to see the hope draining from her eyes, to watch it be replaced by the same terror that was clawing at his own insides. The words were a solid lump of despair lodged in his throat. He had promised her a safe harbor, a place with sunshine and gardens. What he had delivered was a nightmare made of rotting wood and shadows. The shame was a physical force, a heavy hand pressing down on his head, bowing his shoulders. He felt smaller, weaker, and more pathetic than he had in the grimy apartment. There, he was just a man who had run out of money. Here, in this desolate wasteland, he was a fool who had let his own child into the heart of nowhere, armed with nothing but a foolish, broken dream. The weight of his failure was absolute. He forced his legs to move, each step an act of immense will. He walked toward the sagging porch, his boots making soft, squelching sounds in the damp earth. The porch steps groaned ominously under his weight, the wood feeling spongy and treacherous. He placed a hand on the front door and pushed. It didn't swing open. It leaned inward with a high-pitched, agonizing screech of rusted hinges, revealing an interior plunged into almost total darkness. What little light remained from the dying day was swallowed by the gloom. Thick, grey cobwebs, like funeral shrouds, hung from the low ceilings. The floor was an obstacle course of fallen plaster, rotting debris, and the dried droppings of countless small animals. The air inside was even worse, stale and thick. The smell of a place that hadn't breathed in decades. A cold, clammy draught slithered out from the darkness, carrying the scent of grave dirt and regret. There was no light switch, no faucet to turn, just the deep, suffocating darkness, and a silence that felt heavier than stone. The isolation he had felt in the city, surrounded by millions of people, was a comforting blanket compared to this. This was a true, profound loneliness. Here, miles from any living soul, a scream would be devoured by the trees, a shout for help would be answered only by the mocking echo of the wind. They were utterly, completely alone, and they were trapped. The gas tank was empty. The last of their money was gone. He felt the cold truth of their situation settle into his bones. They had traded a slow, managed decline for a rapid, terrifying plunge into the abyss. He felt hollowed out, a shell of a man, stripped of everything, including the lie of hope that had kept him moving. He was back at the end of the line, but this time the line was at the edge of a cliff. He leaned his forehead against the rotting doorframe, the damp, splintered wood pressing into his skin. A violent tremor ran through his entire body, a spasm of pure, undiluted despair. He had clutched a single, miraculous thread of hope, followed it blindly, and it had led him not to safety, but to the absolute bottom of a pit darker than he could have ever imagined. The city had been a slow drowning, but this was a burial. He had driven his daughter to her own grave. A single, hot tear finally broke free, tracing a burning path through the dirt and exhaustion on his cheek. It was a tear not of grief, but of utter defeat. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the crushing weight of it all. The only sound was the wind, whistling a low, mournful tune through the broken bones of the house. A funeral dirge for a dream that had only lived for a day. The first night was a frozen eternity, spent huddled in the cramped confines of the old sedan. The skeletal house loomed in the oppressive darkness, a jagged silhouette against a starless sky, its empty windows like vacant eyes watching their despair. Sleep was impossible. Every gust of wind that rattled the car's frame, every rustle in the unseen undergrowth, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Liam's exhausted body. He felt Maya shivering beside him, even under the thin blanket they shared, and a wave of protective rage, hot and useless, warred with the crushing shame in his gut. He had brought her to this. The scent of damp earth and the distant, mournful hoot of an owl were the only sounds in a world that felt utterly devoid of hope. He was a captain who had steered his ship directly onto the rocks, and now they were stranded, waiting for a tide of cold reality to finally swallow them whole. The failure was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making each breath a conscious, painful effort. Morning arrived, not with a gentle dawn, but with a harsh, grey light that stripped away the shadows and revealed the full, unforgiving horror of their situation. The rot was worse in the daylight. The decay seemed more active, more aggressive. Liam's stomach twisted into a tight, aching knot. He felt a desperate, primal urge to do something, anything, to fight back against the overwhelming sense of defeat. He couldn't fix the collapsed roof or conjure running water, but he couldn't just sit here and let the despair consume them. He had to carve out a single, tiny space of safety, a small act of defiance against the ruin. He looked at the sagging porch, at the front door hanging crookedly from a single hinge. "Stay in the car, Maya Bean," he said, his voice a rough croak. "I'm just going to see if I can make it a little safer." He didn't know if he was trying to convince her or himself, but the act of moving, of having a task, was the only thing keeping him from shattering. He forced his aching body out of the car and approached the house, his boots sinking into the soft, mulch-like ground. The air was cool and heavy with the smell of wet, decaying leaves. He found a long, sturdy-looking piece of fallen timber and, using it as a pry bar, began the grim work of tearing away the most dangerously loose boards from the porch. The sound of splintering wood and the shriek of rusted nails being pulled from their half-century slumber echoed in the unnerving quiet. It was a futile, exhausting task, but the physical exertion focused his mind, channeling his fear and rage into methodical action. He worked for nearly an hour, sweat stinging his eyes and soaking the back of his shirt, his hands already raw and splintered. He was so absorbed in his grim labor, in the rhythm of destruction and small-scale rebuilding, that he didn't immediately notice the silence from within the house. The quiet child who had been watching from the car was no longer there. His heart stopped. "Maya!" His voice was a raw shout, laced with sudden, ice-cold panic. He scrambled off the porch, his eyes darting wildly. He saw the car door was ajar. "Maya!" He ran to the leaning front door and plunged into the dusty gloom of the house, his mind flashing with images of collapsing floors, of venomous snakes coiled in the shadows, of 100 different horrors this derelict place could hold. "Daddy, in here!" Her voice, small and unafraid, came from a room to the right. He burst in to find her sitting on the floor in the middle of what might have once been a bedroom. The air was thick with the chalky scent of crumbling plaster. She wasn't hurt. She was looking at the floorboards, a look of intense concentration on her small face. "Look," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "This one is wobbly." She pushed a single floorboard with the toe of her sneaker, and it rocked back and forth with a dull, wooden clunk that was distinctly different from the solid floor around it. Liam's panic subsided, replaced by a weary curiosity. He knelt beside her, the floor groaning under his weight. He pressed on the board she had indicated. It was loose, its nails long since surrendered to the damp and the passage of time. The wood was darker than the boards around it, as if it had been handled or moved more frequently. A strange feeling, a prickle of intuition, ran up his arm. It was the first thing in this entire cursed place that didn't feel like it was actively trying to crumble into dust. It felt intentional. He looked around the debris-strewn floor and found a short, heavy piece of iron, perhaps a part of an old stove, and carefully wedged its end into the crack beside the loose board. He put his weight on it, using it as a lever. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a prolonged, groaning screech of ancient, protesting nails, the board began to lift, releasing a puff of dust that smelled impossibly old. He pulled the board completely free and set it aside. Maya leaned in closer, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and awe. Beneath, in a shallow hollow carved out of the thick wooden subfloor, lay a nest of cobwebs and desiccated leaves. Liam felt a pang of disappointment. It was probably just a rat's nest, another sign of the house's decay. He was about to replace the board when his eyes caught a flicker of something dark and unnatural within the dusty tangle. It wasn't wood or debris. He cautiously reached in, his fingers brushing away the thick, sticky cobwebs. His fingertips touched something small, solid, and cold, incredibly cold. He pulled it out, bringing it into a sliver of grey light filtering through a crack in the boarded-up window. It was a small object, caked in dirt and grime, attached to the remnants of a delicate, broken chain. It was heavier than it looked, its weight a surprising reality in his palm. He held it in his hand, a strange sense of reverence settling over him. He used the rough fabric of his jeans to wipe away decades of accumulated filth. As the layers of dirt came away, he saw the unmistakable gleam of dark, tarnished silver. It was a locket, small, oval-shaped, and intricately engraved around the edges with a pattern of curling ivy. It wasn't a cheap trinket or a child's toy. This was something of quality, of substance. It felt ancient, imbued with a silent history. He could feel the fine, detailed engraving under his thumb. A knot of confusion tightened in his stomach. Why would something like this be hidden so carefully beneath a floorboard in a derelict house? It was a deliberate act of concealment. The question hung in the dusty air between him and his daughter, a small, solid mystery in a place that had, until now, only offered ruin. The locket felt like a key, though he had no idea what lock it might open. "What is it, Daddy?" Maya whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "It's a locket, honey," he replied, his own voice hushed. He turned it over and over in his palm, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of his skin. The little clasp that held it shut was stiff, sealed by time and neglect. He worked at it carefully with his thumbnail, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He felt a strange premonition, a feeling that this was important, that this small discovery was a turning point. With a final, tiny click that sounded deafeningly loud in the silent room, the locket sprang open. He held his breath, half expecting to see a faded, miniature portrait of some long-dead ancestor, a face from the past staring back at him. But the locket was empty of people. On the left side was a circle of worn, deep blue velvet, now faded to a dusty grey. On the right, however, behind a tiny, perfectly preserved pane of glass, was something far more unexpected. It wasn't a portrait, it was a drawing, an incredibly small, exquisitely detailed illustration rendered in fine black ink. Liam had to hold it close to his eye, squinting in the dim light to make out the details. His breath caught in his throat. He recognized it instantly, with a jolt of shocking familiarity. It was a perfect miniature architectural rendering of the massive stone fireplace that dominated the main room of the house. Every stone was meticulously drawn, every crack and imperfection captured. But the artist had drawn one specific stone near the base on the right side, with a faint, almost invisible X marked upon it. A cold shiver, completely unrelated to the chill of the house, traced a slow path down his spine. This was not a keepsake. This was a map. The locket was a message, sent across time, waiting patiently in the dark for someone to find it. The suffocating despair he'd been drowning in was suddenly pierced by a sharp, focused beam of intense curiosity. He closed the locket with a decisive snap, the small object feeling immensely important in his hand. "Come on," he said to Maya, his voice filled with a new, urgent energy. He stood up and strode out of the bedroom, moving with a purpose he hadn't felt since before his wife got sick. He entered the main room, the cavernous, debris-filled space that had seemed so menacing just an hour before. Now, he saw it with new eyes. The great stone fireplace stood at the far end like a monolithic altar, its massive mantelpiece cracked and covered in a thick layer of grime and bird droppings from the hole in the roof above. It smelled of cold soot, dampness, and the faint, acrid scent of time itself. He held the locket in his left hand, a silver talisman, and approached the stone behemoth. He was no longer a victim of this place. He was an investigator, a treasure hunter, following the first real clue. He felt a surge of adrenaline that was part fear, part exhilarating hope. He knelt before the fireplace, his eyes scanning the area indicated in the drawing. The stones were large, uneven, and fitted together with thick, crumbling mortar. They were cold and slick, with a fine layer of damp grime. Following the locket's cryptic instructions, he began to tap on them, one by one. His knuckles made a series of dull, solid thuds against the dense rock. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was flat, lifeless, absorbed by the stone and the oppressive silence of the house. Maya watched him, her head cocked to the side, a silent partner in his strange quest. Liam felt a flicker of doubt. Maybe he was losing his mind, chasing a fantasy concocted by a child's discovery and his own desperation. This was crazy. He was tapping on rocks in a ruined house in the middle of nowhere. He almost stopped, the sheer absurdity of the situation washing over him. The cold hand of despair began to creep back around his heart. Then he heard it. He had tapped on a stone near the floor, a dark, squarish block of granite, and the sound was wrong. It wasn't the dead thud of the others. It was a lower, resonant thump, a hollow sound. His heart hammered against his ribs. He held his breath and tapped it again. lightly this time. Thump. The sound was unmistakable, a clear indication of a cavity behind the rock. A jolt of pure, electrifying excitement shot through him, chasing away every last shred of doubt. It was real. The drawing was real. He ran his fingers frantically over the edges of the stone, searching for a seam, a weakness. The mortar was thick, but along the top edge, his dirty fingernail caught on a hairline crack that was wider than the others. The stone was a plug, a hidden door. It was designed to be removed. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless. He was on the edge of a secret that had been waiting for decades. He scrambled back to the porch, his mind racing, and retrieved the iron pry bar he had been using earlier. His hands were shaking, not from cold or weakness, but from sheer, unadulterated anticipation. He returned to the fireplace and carefully wedged the flattened tip of the iron bar into the hairline crack above the hollow-sounding stone. He leaned on it with all his weight. For a second, nothing happened. The bar bent slightly under the strain. He grunted with effort, putting his entire body into it. There was a grating, grinding sound of stone scraping against stone, and a puff of fine, grey mortar dust exploded into the air, carrying the dry, dead scent of a sealed tomb. The stone shifted, only a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. He worked the bar back and forth, widening the gap. Slowly, painfully, the heavy stone plug began to pull free from the chimney's structure, revealing a dark, bound square void within. With a final eye-heavy scrape, he pulled the stone completely free and set it carefully on the floor. It left a dark, perfectly square hole in the fireplace about the size of a shoebox. A wave of cold, stagnant air, trapped for who knows how long, washed over his face. He peered into the darkness. His heart was a drum, beating a frantic rhythm in his ears. There, sitting inside the cavity, was a box. It wasn't made of wood. It was a dull, heavy grey, its surface showing the faint lines of seams. He reached in, his fingers trembling, and his hand closed around it. The weight was astonishing. It was far too heavy for its size, and the metal was cold, seeming to suck the warmth directly from his skin. He realized it was a lead-lined box, designed to protect its contents from a fire in the chimney. This was no casual hiding place. Whatever was inside was meant to survive a catastrophe. The secret it held was considered priceless. He lifted the heavy box out of the hole and placed it on the dusty floor between him and Maya. His breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. The box had a simple, heavy clasp on the front. For a moment, he just stared at it, a sense of profound significance settling upon him. This box was the reason for the locket, the reason for the hidden compartment. It was the heart of the mystery. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, he reached out and lifted the clasp. It opened with a soft, metallic click. He slowly, reverently, lifted the heavy lead lid. The first thing that hit him was the smell. It was a scent unlike anything else in the house, not decay, but the rich, dry perfume of old leather and brittle, well-preserved paper. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like faded, dark wool, lay a single object, a thick, leather-bound book, a diary. Its cover was dark, smooth and unmarked by time, perfectly preserved in its leaden sanctuary. His throat was dry. He reached in and lifted the diary from the box. The leather cover was cool and smooth beneath his calloused fingers. It felt important, almost sacred. He could feel the faint outline of the bundled pages through the cover. This was his great-uncle Arthur's diary, the man who had brought him to this place. This book held the answers. He sat back on his heels, the diary resting in his lap, a heavy testament to a life he'd never known. He opened it to a random page in the middle. The paper was thick, cream-colored, and filled from top to bottom with neat, elegant cursive, the ink a faded brownish black. He could make out words like harvest, Caldwell, and regret. He flipped forward, the dry paper whispering as he turned the pages. His eyes scanned the dates, seeing the years pass by, 1973, 1974. Then he froze. A page near the back, dated October 12, 1975, caught his eye. His own name, Liam, was written in the middle of a paragraph. The letters clear and unmistakable. A wave of vertigo washed over him. and the room seemed to tilt. That was impossible. He wasn't born until 1988. How could his name, his specific name, be in a diary written more than a decade before his birth? His blood ran cold. He forced his eyes to focus, to read the sentence that contained his name. The neat, elegant script seemed to mock him, the words burning themselves into his brain. "If Providence is kind, a future heir will be named Liam," Arthur had written. "And when he comes to this place, he must find what I have hidden. He must have the courage I lacked. He must atone for our sin." The diary entry went on to speak of a family crime and a hidden fortune, a terrible secret that had haunted Arthur his entire life. The mystery of the house had just become terrifyingly personal. The words seemed to lift from the page, not as ink, but as ghosts. Liam sat on the dusty floor, the heavy diary open in his lap. Maya curled silently against his side. The weak afternoon light, filtering through the grime-caked windows, caught the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating them like tiny, spectral witnesses. The scent of old paper and leather filled his nostrils, a dry, academic smell that was completely at odds with the tale of brutal sin unfolding in his hands. He felt a profound sense of temporal displacement, as if the last 90 years had collapsed into this single, terrifying moment. Arthur's elegant handwriting was a cold, clear voice speaking from the grave, and Liam felt a bone-deep chill as he began to read from the first pages. His own name, found moments before, was no longer a mystery, but a summons. He was no longer just a desperate father. He was the designated heir to a crime, a chosen recipient of a confession that had festered in darkness for decades, waiting for him. The entry was dated 1932. Liam's throat tightened as he read his great-grandfather's name, a man he'd only known from a single, faded photograph, linked with another, Franklin Caldwell. The diary described a partnership, a sinister pact formed in the desperate heart of the Great Depression. Arthur, who must have been a young man then, wrote not of his father's actions, but of the cold, methodical planning he overheard in late-night meetings, his words imbued with a creeping, boyish terror. The plan was called a consolidation, a sterile, corporate-sounding word for what Liam was beginning to understand was outright theft. The diary spoke of leveraging debt, of exploiting legal loopholes, of preying on the desperation of families already broken by poverty. A cold knot of dread formed in Liam's stomach. This wasn't a story of savvy business. It was the blueprint for a slow, suffocating conquest, written in the language of power, wielded against the powerless. The ink on the page seemed to grow darker, heavier with the weight of its own meaning. He turned a few more pages, the rustle of the dry paper echoing the sound of his own ragged breath. The narrative shifted from legal maneuvering to something far more visceral. Arthur's handwriting, usually so precise, became a spikier, more frantic scrawl as he recounted the enforcement phase. He wrote of night riders, of shadowy figures on horseback carrying torches, their faces hidden by darkness. He described the sound of shattering windows, the terrified screams of children, the acrid smell of smoke from accidental barn fires that always seemed to strike the most stubborn landowners. Liam's heart pounded against his ribs. He could almost hear the phantom cries on the wind whistling through the broken roof. The descriptions were short, brutal, and filled with the shame of a helpless witness. Arthur wrote of families cast out onto the dirt roads with nothing but the clothes on their backs, their meager belongings thrown into the mud, their land deeds now belonging to the unholy partnership of his father and Caldwell. One entry from 1934 was so stark it stole the breath from Liam's lungs. It was about a family, the Donnellys, who owned the small plot of land adjacent to this one. They had refused 3 offers. They had hired a lawyer. They had tried to fight. The diary entry was just 3 sentences, written in a shaky, blotted hand. The Donnelly farm is silent now. Their well has been filled in. Mother says they moved west in the night, but I heard her weeping. Liam felt a wave of nausea, so intense he had to close his eyes. The implication was horrifying, a monstrous act hidden beneath a thin veil of feigned ignorance. The well, filled in. The words painted a picture of such profound evil that Liam felt physically ill. He felt Maya press closer to him, sensing his distress, and he wrapped his arm tighter around her, a desperate, futile gesture of protection against a crime that was nearly a century old, but felt as immediate and as threatening as a coiled snake at his feet. The misfortune was not a myth. Later entries, from the late 1930s, detailed the final stage of the plan, the consolidated lands. Now, a vast, contiguous tract was sold to a national mining concern for an astronomical sum, but the payment was not made in easily traceable currency. Arthur's diary explained that Franklin Caldwell, paranoid and shrewd, had demanded payment in gold bullion. Liam stared at the words, his mind struggling to comprehend the scale of it. Gold, a pirate's treasure, a dragon's hoard, earned not through adventure, but through the tears and blood of dozens of ruined families. The diary described two men, his own great-grandfather and the first Caldwell, dividing the bars in a locked cellar, their greed a tangible, gleaming thing. The weight of the diary in his lap seemed to increase tenfold, as if the gold itself were embedded in its pages. The book was no longer just a confession. It was a ledger of stolen lives and the price they had fetched. Decades passed in the turning of a few pages. Arthur's entries from the 1960s and 70s were the tormented ramblings of a man being eaten alive by his own conscience. His father and Franklin Caldwell were long dead, but their sin lived on, a curse tied to the land and the gold. Arthur wrote of his desperate desire to make things right, to return the fortune to the descendants of the families they had wronged. But he was trapped. The Caldwell family's power had only grown. They were the law in the county, their influence a sprawling like invisible web. To reveal the secret would not bring justice, he wrote. It would only bring his own destruction at the hands of Franklin's son. The gold is a cancer, one entry read, dated 1971. I have buried it deep in the earth, but I can feel its heat through the soles of my shoes. It is a weight on my soul, and it is a weight on this land. Liam could feel that weight now, pressing down on him, a suffocating inheritance of guilt. The final entries were a desperate prayer, consumed by guilt and fear. Arthur had devised his long, improbable plan. He couldn't act himself, but perhaps a future generation could. He researched his own family's history and genealogy, discovering a traditional name, Liam, that appeared every few generations. It became his obsession, his single, fragile hope. He wrote the will, leaving the farm, the heart of the crime, to a future unknown Liam. The diary was his confession, his evidence, and his plea, all rolled into one. You are my last chance at redemption, Arthur wrote on the final page, his words addressed directly to the man holding the book. Be the man I was too cowardly to be. The gold is for them, not for us. Use it to heal the wounds our family created. Avenge the ghosts that walk this land. Liam felt a tremor run through him. This was no longer about a mysterious inheritance. It was a sacred, terrifying duty placed squarely on his shoulders. The sudden, alien sound of a vehicle shattered the tomb-like silence of the house. It wasn't the sputtering complaint of an old car like his own, but a deep, confident rumble of a powerful engine, growing steadily closer. Liam's blood ran cold. Instinct took over. In a single, fluid motion, he snapped the diary shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. He practically threw it back into the heavy lead box, the book landing with a soft thud. He shoved the box back into the dark cavity within the chimney, his fingers fumbling with the heavy stone plug. He scraped it back into place just as the engine noise cut out, plunging the world back into a silence that was now thick with imminent threat. He scrambled to his feet, pulling a terrified Maya up with him, his mind racing. Who was here? Who else could possibly know the way to this forgotten, ruined place? The quiet that followed the engine's cutoff was 100 times more frightening than the sound had been. He heard the crunch of heavy boots on the damp, leaf-strewn ground outside. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and unnervingly confident. It was the sound of someone who felt no fear, who believed they belonged here. A cold sweat broke out on Liam's forehead. He backed away from the fireplace, pulling Maya behind him, trying to shield her small body with his own. He was a cornered animal, his den suddenly invaded by a predator. The fragile sense of purpose he'd felt just moments ago was replaced by a primal, gut-wrenching fear. He had no weapon, no way to defend them. He was a mechanic with splintered hands and a terrified daughter, facing an unknown threat in the heart of nowhere. The footsteps stopped just outside the gaping hole that was the front doorway. A tall, broad figure blocked the fading light, casting a long, dark shadow that stretched across the debris-strewn floor like a grasping hand, reaching for them. A sharp, authoritative rap echoed from the rotting doorframe, a sound of pure formality that was utterly bizarre in this place of total decay. A man stepped through the opening, his form resolving out of the silhouette. He was perhaps in his late 60s, tall and straight-backed, with a mane of distinguished silver hair swept back from a weathered, handsome face. His clothes were what shocked Liam the most: expensive tweed, a crisp shirt, and polished leather boots that seemed immune to the filth of the property. He moved with an easy grace, his pale blue eyes sweeping the ruined interior with an air of detached amusement. A thin, controlled smile played on his lips. "Quite the project you've inherited," he said, his voice a smooth, deep baritone that carried easily in the still air. It was a voice accustomed to being listened to, a voice of command wrapped in a veneer of civility. The man's presence was an immediate and overwhelming assertion of power. The man took another step inside, his expensive cologne, a scent of cedar and old money, momentarily overpowering the smell of mold and rot. He extended a hand, though Liam made no move to take it. "Alistair Caldwell," he announced, the name landing in the silent room with the force of a dropped stone. "My family has owned the surrounding properties for the better part of a century." Caldwell, the name from the diary. Liam felt a jolt, as if he'd touched a live wire. The world seemed to shrink, the air growing thin and electric. This was the grandson, the heir to the other half of the crime. Caldwell's pale eyes, the color of a winter sky, flicked from Liam to Maya, lingering on the child for a fraction of a second too long before returning to the room. His gaze was proprietary, as if he were inspecting a piece of property that was already his, and he was merely tolerating the squatters he'd found upon it. The man's civility felt like a mask, and Liam could sense the cold, reptilian thing moving just beneath it. "I won't mince words," Caldwell continued, his smooth voice filling the cavernous space. He gestured vaguely at the hole in the roof, the crumbling walls. "This place is a wreck, a liability. Frankly, it's an eyesore that's dragging down the value of my own land." He spoke with the easy paternalism of the very wealthy, a tone that assumed his judgment was fact and his desires were foregone conclusions. He reached into the inner pocket of his tweed jacket and produced a slim, leather-bound checkbook. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'm prepared to take it off your hands, help you and your little girl get a proper start somewhere else." He uncapped a fountain pen with a soft click. $5,000, he said, the number a laughable insult. "More than this pile of sticks is worth. I can have a check in your hand right now." The offer was a test, a casual dismissal of Liam's existence, of his right to be there. It was a display of power meant to crush him, a cold, hard fury solidified in Liam's chest, burning away the edges of his fear. $5,000. Was that the price of his silence? The price of the Donnelly family? Of all the others? He thought of Arthur's words, the desperate plea for courage written in the diary, now hidden just a few feet away. He looked down at Maya, who was clutching his pant leg, her small face a mask of confusion and fear. He had brought her here, to this place of ghosts and sin. But he would be damned if he let this man, this vulture, chase them away. He had to honor the dead. He had to honor Arthur's final wish. He had to be the man his great-uncle had prayed for. He met Caldwell's icy gaze, his own voice sounding distant and unfamiliar to his own ears, but steady as stone. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Caldwell," he said slowly, "but I'm not interested in selling." The words hung in the air between them, a final, irrevocable line drawn in the dust. The transformation was chilling. In the blink of an eye, the charming, patrician mask disintegrated, revealing the raw, predatory face beneath. Alistair Caldwell's smile vanished, his lips thinning into a hard, cruel line. the warmth in his pale blue eyes extinguished, leaving behind 2 chips of glacial ice. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The man didn't move, but his entire posture radiated a sudden, potent menace. He was no longer a friendly neighbor. He was a king whose decree had just been challenged by a peasant, and he was not accustomed to it. "That would be unwise," Caldwell said, his voice losing its smooth baritone and dropping into a low, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate in Liam's very bones. He took a single, deliberate step forward, invading Liam's space, his towering frame blocking what little light was left, plunging them deeper into shadow. The smell of his cologne was now suffocating, the scent of a predator closing in. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper that was meant for Liam alone. "This old house, it's a dangerous place." His gaze flickered meaningfully towards the sagging rafters overhead. Rotten timber, unstable foundations, so isolated. Accidents happen out here. He let the words hang in the air, each one a perfectly polished stone of threat. His eyes bored into Liam's, then deliberately dropped to stare at Maya, who flinched and tried to hide further behind her father's leg. The message was unmistakable, a cold, calculated promise of violence, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "A man with a young daughter," Caldwell murmured, straightening up, the charming mask slipping partially back into place. "He should be careful, very, very careful." He turned without another word and walked away, his heavy footsteps receding into the twilight, leaving the threat hanging in the air, thick and poisonous. What would you do in his position? Would you take the unspoken warning, pack up your child and flee for your lives? Or would you stay and fight for a justice you now have no choice but to represent, knowing the cost could be everything you have left? The silence Caldwell left behind was more terrifying than his voice. It was a living, breathing entity, filled with the echo of his threat. Liam stood frozen in the center of the room, his arm a rigid bar of steel around Maya, who was trembling uncontrollably. He could still smell the man's expensive cologne, a phantom scent of cedar and menace that clung to the air, a stark violation of the natural decay of the house. A cold, paralytic fear seized him, far worse than the despair he'd felt upon arriving. This was no longer about poverty or homelessness, it was about survival. The diary in its lead box felt like a block of ice against the chimney stone, a secret that had just become a death sentence. His heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs, each beat a separate explosion of terror. He was not just a fool who had stumbled into a ruin, he was a witness who had just been marked for death. He looked around at the collapsing walls, and they no longer seemed like a prison of poverty, but a pre-dug grave, waiting to be filled. He had to get them out. The thought screamed in his mind, a raw, primal instinct. But where could they go? The car was out of gas, their last dollar spent on stale crackers and the journey here. They were trapped, marooned in the heart of Caldwell's kingdom. A hysterical, choked laugh escaped his lips. He had run from the city to escape a slow eviction, only to face an express execution. The sheer, brutal irony of it was a physical blow. He forced the panic down, his mechanic's mind, so long dormant, desperately searching for a problem to solve, a way out. Running blindly was suicide. Caldwell owned everything, knew everyone. They would be caught on the road within minutes. He needed a plan, he needed leverage, he needed proof, and he needed an ally. The diary was the proof, but it was useless if he was dead. His mind latched onto the one other piece of the puzzle he held, the only thing that existed outside this cursed farm. The tarnished silver locket. It was a key, a message. It was his only hope. The next morning, the grey light felt threatening, every shadow a potential hiding place for one of Caldwell's men. Every creak of the rotting house was an approaching footstep. The paranoia was a physical thing, a constant electric hum beneath his skin. He had to get to the nearest town. It was a desperate gamble, but staying was certain death. He spent an hour siphoning the last dregs of gasoline from the car's tank into a small can, then pouring it back in. A meticulous, nerve-wracking process that yielded barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. He bundled a terrified, silent Maya into the passenger seat, wrapping her in their only blanket. "It's okay, Maya Bean," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "We're just going for a little drive, to see the town." As he coaxed the old car back to life, its sputtering engine sounding like a cannon blast in the quiet dread, he felt the suffocating sensation of being watched from the dark woods surrounding them. The drive was an agonizing crawl through a green tunnel of fear. The branches that had scraped the car on their arrival now sounded like skeletal fingers clawing at the metal, trying to hold them back. Liam's eyes darted constantly to the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, expecting the confident grille of Caldwell's truck to appear at any moment. The 10 miles to the town of Havenwood felt like 1,000. The needle on the fuel gauge hovered precariously over empty, a constant, mocking reminder of how close to the edge they were. When the first buildings of the town finally appeared through the trees, Liam felt a wave of relief so profound it left him dizzy. It was a small, sleepy town, a collection of old brick storefronts and quiet residential streets that seemed trapped in a bygone era. It felt safe, but he knew it was an illusion. Caldwell's influence was an invisible poison that had surely seeped into this place as well. He had to be careful. He parked the car in front of a small grocery store, the engine dying with a final, pathetic cough. He scanned the street, his heart pounding. He saw a post office, a barber shop, and then, at the end of the block, a small storefront with faded gold lettering on the window. Havenwood Antiques and Curiosities. The word antiques snagged in his mind. The locket. It was old. Whoever owned that shop would know about old things, about local history. It was a long shot, a desperate leap of faith, but it was the only one he had. He took a deep, shuddering breath and turned to Maya. "I'll be right back. I need you to be very brave and stay here. Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone, okay?" She just nodded, her eyes huge and dark in her pale face. He pocketed the cold, heavy locket, the metal a small, solid weight of purpose in his hand, and walked towards the shop, feeling 1,000 unseen eyes on his back. He was walking into the lion's den, armed with nothing but a ghost's trinket. A small brass bell chimed softly as he pushed open the door, a sound too gentle for the storm raging inside him. The air in the shop was cool and still, thick with the scent of lemon oil polish, old paper, and the faint, dry perfume of dust. It was a place crowded with the ghosts of other people's lives. Grandfather clocks ticked in a hushed, asynchronous chorus, their pendulums swinging like patient metronomic hearts. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through the front window, illuminating precarious stacks of books, mismatched china, and the vacant glass eyes of porcelain dolls. The silence was deep, a velvet curtain that absorbed the sounds of the outside world. It felt like a sanctuary, a pocket of stillness outside of time. Behind a massive oak counter at the back of the room, a woman sat perfectly still in a high-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't reading or working, she was simply watching, and he had the distinct feeling she had been waiting for him. She was ancient, a delicate piece of history herself. Her face was a fine, intricate web of wrinkles, a testament to a long and deeply lived life. But her eyes were startlingly clear and sharp, the color of dark, polished stones. They missed nothing. Her white hair was pinned up in a neat, old-fashioned bun, and she wore a simple, dark dress with a lace collar. She didn't smile or greet him. She just watched him approach the counter, her gaze steady and unnervingly perceptive. He felt clumsy and out of place, his dirty jeans and grease-stained hands a desecration in this temple of preserved memories. The words he had rehearsed in his head evaporated, leaving him mute and awkward. All the fear and paranoia, the weight of the diary and Caldwell's threat coalesced into a single, hard lump of desperation in his throat. He stopped in front of the counter, the ticking of the clocks seeming to grow louder, counting down the seconds of his indecision. He couldn't speak. Instead, his hand trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket. He placed it on the polished wood of the counter, the tarnished silver a stark, ugly thing against the rich, dark surface. He gave it a small push, and it slid across the wood, coming to a stop directly in front of her. Her sharp eyes flicked down to the object, then back up to his face, a silent question in their depths. For a long moment, she didn't move. She simply looked at the locket, her expression unreadable. Liam's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He had staked everything on this one desperate move, this one object connecting him to the past. If she dismissed it, if she saw it as just another piece of junk, he was lost. He had nowhere else to go, no other thread to pull. The entire weight of his and Maya's survival rested on this tiny piece of metal and the memories of the old woman who was now staring at it with an unnerving, absolute stillness. Slowly, she reached out a hand, her fingers gnarled with arthritis, but surprisingly steady. She didn't pick up the locket immediately. She gently touched its surface, her index finger tracing the engraved ivy pattern with a strange, hesitant familiarity, as if greeting an old, long-lost friend. Her touch was a question, a caress, a confirmation, a flicker of some powerful, buried emotion disturbed the placid surface of her face. She picked it up, the small object looking impossibly fragile in her palm. With a practiced, gentle motion, she turned it over. Liam held his breath. He saw her eyes fix on the back of the locket, where a tiny, almost worn-away crest was engraved into the silver. Her breath hitched, a tiny, sharp intake of air that was deafening in the quiet shop. Her hand, the one holding the locket, began to tremble. The mask of calm detachment shattered, and in her eyes he saw the sudden, shocking reappearance of a ghost. The locket was not just an antique to her, it was a memory, a wound. "My God," she whispered, her voice a dry, papery rustle. "The Donnelly locket." She looked up at him, and her eyes were no longer just sharp. They were filled with a fierce, ancient pain. "My mother gave this to her sister, Maeve, the day she was married. It was the last time we ever saw her." The name from the diary, Donnelly, the family whose well was filled in. The truth of it, spoken aloud by a living person, hit Liam with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The woman's name was Ilara. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to an intense, urgent whisper. "That farm, the old Beck place, that's where you've come from, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She saw it all in his face. The dirt, the exhaustion, the terror. The locket was not a coincidence. It was a key that had finally found its lock, and she was the one who could turn it. The story, the real story, was about to be told. And so it was. The words poured out of her, a torrent of memory and pain held back for 80 years. She told him of a time when the valley wasn't just Caldwell land, but a patchwork of small farms, each with a family and a name. Her family, Maeve's family, the Donnellys. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were distant, seeing the ghosts of her childhood. She spoke of the pressure, the lowball offers from Franklin Caldwell and Liam's own great-grandfather, a man she remembered as a shadow with cold eyes. She described the fear that began to permeate the community like a sickness, the whispers, the threats, the sudden, inexplicable misfortunes that befell anyone who refused to sell. Her story was a perfect, horrifying echo of Arthur's diary. But this was not ink on a page. It was living testimony, etched into the memory of a survivor. The air in the shop grew colder, heavier, as she resurrected the crimes of the past. She remembered the night the Donnellys vanished. She was only 8 years old, the same age as Maya. She recalled the shouting, the sound of breaking wood carried on the night wind, and then a terrible, profound silence that fell over the neighboring farm. The next morning, the adults spoke in hushed, terrified whispers. They said the Donnellys had packed up and gone west, but Ilara knew it was a lie. She had seen the tracks of heavy wagons near their well, and the ground was freshly, unnaturally disturbed. She remembered the look on her own father's face, a look of utter defeat and terror. 2 weeks later, her own family was forced out, given pennies on the dollar for land that had been theirs for generations. They left with a single cart of belongings, joining a sad exodus of broken families, their lives and histories erased to make way for the Caldwell Empire. She had never been back. She had never forgotten. Ilara's gaze fell back to the locket in her hand, her knuckles white. "I always wondered what happened to Arthur Beck," she said softly, her voice thick with a complex mix of pity and contempt. "He was just a boy then, always sketching in a notebook, with sad, haunted eyes. After his father died, he became a ghost. We all knew the Caldwells owned him. He never left that property. We'd see him from a distance, just a shape in the fields. People said he was crazy, but I think he was a prisoner, trapped in that house with the ghosts of what his father did. She looked at Liam, her eyes boring into him. The Caldwells don't just own the land, son. They own the past. They own the silence, and they will kill to keep it that way. Her words confirmed Liam's deepest fears. Arthur hadn't been a monster, but a victim, a tormented soul who had tried to leave a breadcrumb trail out of hell, and Liam had just picked it up. He told her everything. The words came in a frantic, desperate rush. The will, the ruin of the house, the diary, the gold, and Caldwell's visit. He told her about Maya, about the chilling threat against his daughter. As he spoke, Ilara listened with that same profound stillness, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The story, which had felt so insane and solitary in the rotting farmhouse, became terrifyingly real as he said it aloud in this quiet shop. When he finished, the only sound was the ticking of the clocks, each tick a second stolen from him and Maya. Ilara's face was grim, her lips a thin, hard line. She had not just heard a story, she had heard the final chapter of her own life's great injustice finally being written. The ghosts she had lived with for 80 years were now screaming for a reckoning, and she was looking at the unlikely man chosen to deliver it. She was no longer just a shopkeeper, she was the last witness, the guardian of a buried truth. "You can't go back there," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "He will not make a second threat." She stood up, her small frame possessed of a sudden, surprising strength. "He knows what that land represents. He knows its secrets are buried there. Your presence on it is a loose thread that could unravel his entire world." She came around the counter, her movements deliberate and certain. The fragile old woman was gone, replaced by a fierce matriarch, a warrior forged in loss and memory. She took Liam by the arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You and the girl will stay with me, but you need the diary. That book is more than a confession. It's a weapon. It's the only thing that can burn their whole rotten kingdom to the ground." The plan was insane, to go back to the farm now after everything, but looking into her fierce, determined eyes, Liam knew she was right. Without the diary, he was just a terrified man with a wild story. With it, he was justice. The journey back to the farm was a descent into a nightmare. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that danced across the dirt track was a prelude to an ambush. But Ilara's words had forged a new, hard resolve in his heart. The fear was still there, a cold, metallic taste in the back of his throat, but it was now overlaid with a righteous, burning anger. He wasn't just running for his life, he was fighting for the Donnellys, for Ilara's family, for Arthur, and for the dozens of other nameless ghosts whose lives had been stolen. He was their unlikely, terrified champion. As he drove, he explained a simplified version to Maya, that they had to get a very important book from the house, and then they would go stay with a nice lady. Her silence was more unnerving than tears. She simply held his hand, her small fingers gripping his with a desperate strength, a silent partner in their terrifying quest. The car sputtered to a halt in the clearing, and the skeletal house waited, a silent, menacing maw. As he got out of the car, a flicker of movement down the main road, barely visible through the trees, caught his eye. It was the glint of sun on the windshield of a dark vehicle parked half a mile away, where the dirt track met the paved road. A black sedan, the same one from town. A cold, sickening dread washed over him. Caldwell. He had been seen leaving Ilara's shop. The king knew the peasant had found an ally. The clock had been ticking before. Now it had just struck midnight. The pretense was over. Caldwell knew that Liam knew, and that Ilara knew. The secret was no longer contained. Liam's blood ran cold. He had thought he might have until morning. He was wrong. They would be coming for him. And they would be coming tonight. The time for planning and caution was over. All that was left was a frantic, desperate scramble for survival. The game had changed from a cold war of threats to a hot war of extermination. He ran into the house, the urgency a live wire in his veins. The air inside felt heavy, charged with a final, waiting doom. He went straight to the fireplace, his hands shaking as he pried the heavy stone plug free. The scraping sound was deafening in the silence, a broadcast of his actions to anyone who might be listening. He pulled the lead box from its cavity, the weight of it a solid, reassuring reality. This was it, the truth, the weapon. He didn't bother to close the compartment. There was no time. He ran back towards the door. The heavy box clutched to his chest like a shield, his mind racing. He had to get Maya and the diary and run. But run where? The car was out of gas. Their only escape route was cut off. They were boxed in, trapped in the kill zone. A wave of pure animal panic threatened to overwhelm him. He was a rat in a trap, and the jaws were closing. He looked at Maya's terrified face in the car, and a father's protective instinct roared to life, burning through the fear. Night fell like a black shroud, thick and starless. The oppressive silence of the countryside was no longer a comfort, but a canvas for terror, amplifying every tiny sound. Liam and Maya were huddled inside the rotting house now, the car too exposed. He had barricaded the front door with a heavy, fallen beam, a futile gesture he knew wouldn't stop anyone for more than a few seconds. He held the cold lead box in his lap, the diary inside a silent testament to the evil that was now gathering in the darkness outside. He held a terrified, shivering Maya close, her small body trembling against his. "It's okay, baby," he whispered into her hair, the words a hollow lie. His ears strained, trying to pass the normal night sounds, the wind, the insects, from the ones he dreaded. He felt like a soldier in a foxhole, waiting for the inevitable bombardment to begin, his stomach a tight, aching knot of pure fear. The house was a tomb, and the air was growing thin. Desperate, he lit a single match, its flare a shocking bloom of light in the total darkness. He opened the diary one last time, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the pages. He wasn't reading the confession now, he was looking for a miracle. He remembered Arthur's last entry, the plea for courage, and then he saw it, on the very last page. Something he had overlooked in his earlier haste. It wasn't writing. It was a drawing, a small, crudely sketched map of the farmhouse's foundation. It showed the main house, and behind it, a small square labeled root cellar. An arrow pointed from inside the cellar to a spot on the back wall, marked with the same X as the Lockett's drawing. Next to it, a single, hastily scrawled word, tunnel. A surge of adrenaline, so powerful it made him gasp, shot through him. Arthur hadn't just left a confession, he had left an escape route. It was a chance, a slim, desperate, beautiful chance. He was just about to extinguish the match when he heard it, the sound he had been dreading, the low, distant rumble of an engine, driving without headlights, growing closer. It stopped somewhere down the track, 100 yards from the house. The silence that followed was absolute, a suffocating vacuum of anticipation. Liam's blood turned to ice. They were here. He blew out the match, plunging them back into darkness. He grabbed Maya, his other hand gripping the handle of the heavy lead box. "Stay with me. Do not make a sound," he whispered, his voice a tight, strained rasp. He could hear the soft, cautious crunch of footsteps on the gravelly dirt outside. 2 sets, maybe 3. They were moving with a predatory stealth, circling the house, their presence a palpable wave of malice that radiated through the rotting walls. He backed away from the door, pulling Maya with him towards the rear of the house. The smell hit him first, sharp and chemical, slicing through the scent of decay. Gasoline. His stomach clenched violently. They weren't just here to threaten him. They weren't just here for the diary. They were here to erase everything. The house, the proof, the witnesses. A violent tremor racked his body. This was the end Caldwell had planned for them, a fiery accident in a derelict house, a tragedy that would be a footnote in the local paper before being forgotten forever. He heard the soft clank of a metal can being set down on the porch, followed by the unscrewing of a cap. He backed further into the darkness, his breath held tight in his chest, his mind screaming. He was a mechanic, a father. He was not a soldier. How could he possibly fight this? How could he protect his daughter from men who came in the night with fire and murder in their hearts? The feeling of helplessness was absolute, a cold, crushing weight. A sudden, explosive crash of shattering glass from the front room made them both jump violently. Maya let out a small, terrified cry. which Liam instantly muffled with his hand. He heard the splash of liquid, the unmistakable sound of gasoline being sloshed across the dry, tinder-like floorboards of the main room. He could hear the low murmur of men's voices, rough and emotionless. Get it all. He wants it to go up fast. The words, cold and businesslike, confirmed his worst fears. They were going to burn them alive. There was no more time. The finality of it, the sheer, brutal evil of it, ignited a spark in him. The fear was still there, but now it was forged into a weapon. He would not let them die here. He would not let Maya be consumed by the fire of Caldwell's greed. The instinct to survive, the fierce, primal love for his child, erupted inside him, a supernova of desperate, focused rage. Go, now, he hissed, half pulling, half carrying Maya towards the back of the house. He kicked open the rotted back door, which flew from its hinges and crashed into the darkness. They stumbled outside into the cold night air, the smell of gasoline even stronger here. He remembered the map, the root cellar. It was a separate structure, a mound of earth with two slanted wooden doors a few yards from the house. He scrambled towards it, dragging Maya and the heavy lead box, his lungs burning. He could hear the men inside the house, shouting in surprise as they heard the back door crash. "Hey, he's in the back!" The hunt was on. He reached the cellar doors and tore them open, the old wood groaning in protest. He shoved Maya down into the darkness ahead of him. "Go to the bottom, honey. Go!" He tumbled in after her, pulling the heavy doors shut just as the first flicker of orange light bloomed against the side of the house. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of damp earth, potatoes and cold stone. It was a small, cramped space, no more than 10 feet square. Liam's hands flew to the back wall, his fingers frantically searching the cold, rough-hewn stones, just as Arthur's map had shown. "What are you doing, Daddy?" Maya sobbed from the corner. "Finding the way out," he grunted, his voice tight with exertion and terror. His fingers, raw and scraped, flew over the surface. It had to be here. A loose stone, a hidden lever, anything. Above them, he could hear the roar as the fire caught, a hungry, whooshing sound that was growing louder by the second. He heard the men shouting outside the cellar doors. "Check the cellar!" Heavy footsteps pounded on the wooden doors above them, followed by the sickening thud of an axe splitting the wood. They were running out of time. His hand closed over a stone that felt different from the others. It was smoother, with a small, indented groove along the edge. He pulled. The stone didn't budge. He braced his feet against the damp earth floor and pulled with all his might, his muscles screaming in protest. It was a weight of a century of silence and fear. With a low, grinding groan of stone on stone, it moved an inch, then another. He worked his fingers into the gap and pulled again, a raw, guttural cry of desperation tearing from his throat. The stone swung inwards, revealing a rectangle of absolute, impenetrable blackness. The tunnel, a wave of cold, stagnant air carrying the scent of deep earth and roots, washed over him. At the same moment, the cellar doors above them splintered and burst open, and the terrifying silhouette of a man holding an axe appeared, framed against the roaring, orange inferno of the burning farmhouse. "There they are!" the man yelled. Liam didn't hesitate. He shoved the lead box into the tunnel, grabbed Maya and pushed her in after it. He scrambled in behind her, pulling the heavy stone door shut just as the man lunged for him. He heard the axe blade clang uselessly against the outside of the stone. They were in total, suffocating darkness. The tunnel was impossibly narrow, a claustrophobic tube of dirt and rock. He could hear Maya crying softly just ahead of him. "Crawl, Maya! Just keep crawling," he urged, his voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. He pushed the heavy lead box ahead of him, its corners digging into the soft earth. The air was thin, tasting of dirt and stone. Above and behind them, he could hear the muffled shouts of the men and the terrifying roar of the fire consuming the house, consuming the evidence, consuming the past. They crawled on their hands and knees through the suffocating blackness, roots grabbing at their clothes. The damp earth cold beneath their hands, it was a primal, terrifying rebirth, a crawl through the guts of the earth, away from the fiery hell above. The tunnel seemed to go on for an eternity, a black, endless throat. Liam's lungs burned, his knees and hands were raw and bleeding, but he kept pushing forward, driven by the sound of Maya's soft whimpers ahead of him. He had no idea where they were going, only that they were moving away from death. Then he felt it. A change in the air, a faint, cool breeze on his face. He saw a sliver of faint, grey light ahead, the end of the tunnel. With a final, desperate surge of energy, he pushed himself forward, emerging from a tangle of thorny bushes into the deep woods, 100 yards from the inferno that had been the farmhouse. He pulled Maya out after him, and they lay on the damp leaves, gasping for the clean, cold night air, their bodies trembling with shock and exhaustion. The farmhouse was now a towering pillar of flame, a raging funeral pyre lighting up the night sky, its roar a furious, defeated scream. He didn't let them rest. He scooped a sobbing Maya into his arms, her small body feeling impossibly light. He grabbed the handle of the lead box, its weight a terrible, necessary burden. He had to keep moving. He looked through the trees, searching for a landmark, for any sign of hope. And then he saw it. Far in the distance, through the dark trunks of the ancient trees, a single, tiny point of yellow light. A lamp in a window. Ilara's house. It was miles away, an impossible distance, but it was a beacon in the terrifying darkness. It was the only sanctuary left in the world. With his daughter in one arm and the diary in the other, Liam began to run, fueled by the last dregs of adrenaline and a father's desperate, unyielding love. He ran away from the fire and the ghosts, towards the one small light that represented their only chance at justice, their only hope for a dawn. They burst through Ilara's back door like apparitions, born of fire and earth. Liam, half carrying a catatonic Maya, collapsed onto the clean linoleum of the kitchen floor, the heavy lead box thudding beside him. The air was instantly filled with the acrid stench of smoke that clung to their clothes and hair, mingled with the smell of damp soil and coppery fear. Liam's body was a taut wire of shock, trembling violently, his mind a white-hot static of roaring flames and splintering wood. Ilara didn't panic. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this war her entire life. She wrapped a thick, warm blanket around Maya's shaking shoulders, her gnarled hands surprisingly gentle. Then, while Liam was still gasping for breath on her floor, she picked up the heavy, black rotary phone on her wall. He heard the smooth, confident clicks as she dialed, her voice, when she spoke, not a frail whisper, but a cold, hard piece of iron. "David," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's time. They tried to kill him." An hour later, headlights cut through the darkness outside. Ilara's grandson, David, was not the polished city lawyer Liam might have expected. He was a man in his late 30s, with tired, intelligent eyes and a quiet intensity that seemed to suck all the frantic energy out of the room. He walked in, his gaze immediately taking in the scene, the soot-stained man on his floor, the traumatized child wrapped in a blanket, and the heavy lead box sitting on the kitchen table like an unexploded bomb. He knelt beside Liam, his voice calm and steady. "My grandmother told me the basics. Tell me everything." As Liam recounted the night's events, his voice cracking. David listened without interruption, his expression hardened, his jaw setting into a line of cold, controlled fury. He opened the diary, his eyes scanning Arthur's confession. He closed it with a soft thud. "Okay," he said, and the word was a promise of retribution. "They didn't just try to kill you. They declared war on the state." A new sound filled the air, the clicking of keys as David opened a laptop, the quiet hum of the legal machine beginning to turn. The Attorney General's office in the state capital was a world away from the rot of the farm. It was a place of polished marble floors, hushed tones, and the weight of institutional power. The air smelled of clean paper and faint, expensive air freshener. Liam, dressed in a borrowed shirt that felt stiff and foreign, sat at a long, gleaming mahogany table. He felt like a ghost haunting a world he didn't belong to. Across from him sat the state attorney general, a woman with a formidable reputation and eyes that saw straight through deception. Beside him, Ilara sat ramrod straight, a figure of small, indomitable dignity. Liam told his story again, the words less frantic now, honed into a sharp, painful narrative of fact. He spoke of the locket, of Caldwell's threat, of the gasoline and the fire. Then Ilara spoke. Her voice, clear and strong, bridged the 90-year gap, giving names to the ghosts and context to the crime. Finally, David pushed the diary into the center of the table. It lay there, a dark, leather-bound heart, its silent confession screaming across the decades. The evidence was a cascade, an avalanche that buried a century of lies. The Attorney General's investigators, armed with the names and dates from Arthur's diary, descended upon the county archives. What they found was a perfect match. Forged deeds, missing persons reports that were never investigated, property transfers for impossibly low sums, all bearing the signatures of Franklin Caldwell and Liam's great-grandfather. The diary was the key, a Rosetta Stone of corruption that unlocked every closed door. Ilara's witness statement, a living link to the original crime's cart, was irrefutable. The discovery of the Donnelly locket on the Beck property corroborated her account of the family's ties, and Liam's testimony, along with the physical evidence of gasoline residue collected from his clothes by investigators, provided the modern-day proof of attempted murder. It was a case built not on circumstantial evidence, but on a chain of proof that stretched, unbroken, from the Great Depression to the smoldering ruins of the farmhouse. Warrants were issued before the sun had fully risen. Alistair Caldwell was enjoying his breakfast on a sun-drenched stone terrace overlooking the vast expanse of land his family had ruled for generations. The air was crisp, the coffee was hot, and the morning paper foretold another day of his own uninterrupted reign. He never heard the sirens. A fleet of unmarked state police cars and federal vehicles crunched up his pristine gravel driveway, their movements swift and silent. Officers, clad in tactical vests, swarmed the estate with quiet, professional menace. Caldwell looked up from his paper, a flicker of annoyance on his face, which quickly curdled into disbelief and then cold, reptilian fury as two state detectives walked onto his terrace. "Alistair Caldwell," one said, his voice flat and unimpressed by the opulence, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists was a small, sharp sound that echoed the snapping of a dynasty. The mask of the respected landowner was gone forever, revealing the panicked, snarling face of a common thug caught in the act. His kingdom had crumbled before he had even finished his coffee. While Caldwell was being processed, a second team of federal agents, guided by the crude map on the diary's final page, descended on a different part of the vast Caldwell estate, the ruins of a small, 19th-century chapel his family had acquired in the 1930s. They brought ground-penetrating radar and heavy equipment. The map pointed to the spot directly beneath where the altar had once stood. After hours of careful excavation, a shovel struck something that wasn't stone or earth. It was a series of long, lead-lined crates sealed with wax. When they were pried open, the agents fell silent. Inside, nestled in rotting straw, lay the gold bullion. It didn't gleam like pirate treasure. It was dull, heavy and cold, each bar stamped with the mark of a long-defunct bank. The sheer weight of it, the physical reality of the stolen fortune, was staggering. The next day, the story broke, a media firestorm that electrified the state. The Havenwood Sins, the headlines called it. A century-old crime brought to light by a desperate father, and a book written by a ghost. The gold, once a curse that festered in the earth, was transformed into a beacon of justice. Under David's fierce management, the massive fortune was used to establish the Havenwood family's restitution fund. The national news coverage of the case acted as a call to arms, and soon descendants of the families driven from their land began to come forward from all over the country. They brought their own faded photographs, their own half-forgotten family stories of a mysterious flight from their ancestral homes. Ilara, now a celebrated figure of resilience, became the heart of the movement. She met with each family, her sharp memory providing the missing pieces to their personal histories, her unwavering dignity giving them a voice they never knew they had. The money was a form of justice, but the validation, the public acknowledgement of the crime committed against their ancestors, was the true healing. Liam watched it all, feeling the immense weight of Arthur's tortured soul finally. Blessedly, finding its peace through the actions he had set in motion. In a quiet, sunlit courtroom months later, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The charges against Caldwell and his men were extensive, from attempted murder and arson to federal fraud charges that would keep them imprisoned for the rest of their lives. But this hearing was about Liam. The judge, looking down at him from the bench, spoke of courage and civic duty. In recognition of his role in uncovering one of the most significant cases of historical fraud in the state's history, the court awarded him a substantial financial reward from the seized Caldwell assets. More importantly, the judge's gavel came down with a firm, final crack, granting Liam the full-time, unencumbered, and clear title to the 150 acres of land his great-uncle had left him. The property, once a symbol of a curse and a ruinous trap, was now his, truly his. As he walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon, he didn't feel the thrill of victory or the satisfaction of wealth. He felt a profound, quiet calm, like a ship that had finally, after a long and violent storm, reached a safe harbor. 1 year later, the scent on the wind was not of rot, but of sawdust and fresh paint. Where the skeletal ruin of the farmhouse had stood, a new home was rising, its sturdy frame a testament to a new beginning. The sounds were not the groans of decay, but the rhythmic rap of a hammer and the cheerful whine of a saw. Liam, his face weathered by the sun and his hands strong and sure once more, was fitting a rail to the new porch. He was a mechanic again, not just fixing what was broken, but building something strong and lasting from scratch. In the field beyond the house, a splash of color moved through a sea of wildflowers. It was Maya, her bright laughter carried on the breeze, a sound no longer tinged with fear, but ringing with pure, unadulterated joy. The air smelled of pine lumber, overturned earth from a newly planted vegetable garden, and the promise of a future. He had not just rebuilt a house, he had rebuilt a life, laying a new foundation of safety and hope for his daughter, a foundation that no one could ever shake. The light from the new windows of the house spilled out onto the porch, warm and inviting. Inside, at a large wooden dining table that Liam had built with his own hands, a feast was laid out. A roasted chicken sat golden brown in the center, surrounded by bowls of fresh vegetables from their garden. Ilara sat at one end, her eyes twinkling, and her grandson David sat across from her, a rare, relaxed smile on his face. Liam looked across the table at Maya, who was happily chewing a piece of warm bread, a smear of butter on her cheek. He remembered the stale crackers and lukewarm water, the gnawing hunger and suffocating despair of their journey. He felt a wave of gratitude so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. This was the real treasure. Not the gold, not the land, but this moment, this safety, this family, this home. The ghosts of the farm were finally silent, replaced by the sounds of laughter and love. Stories like Liam's remind us that even in the darkest ruins, the seeds of justice can grow. If you want to hear more stories of struggle and redemption, subscribe to our channel and become part of our community.